I rarely heard about the history of slavery in the Dutch world. Whenever learning about the history of slavery, it was always in the context of the United States. So, for example, Roots was very popular. In high school, we had a whole curriculum based on slavery in the U.S. that I actually had to take an exam, like the final exam to get out of high school was, that was one of the main topics. But it never was about slavery in the broader Dutch world. And so when I finally kind of started exploring this history myself and found out the extent of it, I kind of made it my mission to learn more about this history and be able in that way to contribute to our understanding of this history so that other people hopefully, you know, will be exposed to that more so. Now, or more than I was. Now, I was especially interested initially in Suriname, which, you know, if you're interested in the history of slavery in the Dutch world, then you're oftentimes directed to the history of Suriname. But over time, as I learned more and more about New Netherlands and New York and the history of slavery there and how that really was something that we rarely heard about, I was drawn into researching that more. And I mean, I grew up with great stories about Peter Stuyvesant. It was always, you know, like the Dutch used to own New York. It was kind of with that sentiment. But rarely was it mentioned that it was enslaved people who helped build that colony and settle that colony for the Dutch. So I wrote this book, and it's based on my dissertation. And my dissertation really looked more at cultural exchanges. But as I was working to revise this, I became more and more fascinated in looking at spaces. And that's eventually what I ended up looking at, and what the title is about, Spaces of Enslavement. And this really, in some ways, began when I visited the Maison des Esclaves in Gorée Island, off of the coast of Dakar in Senegal. I went there with my husband, who's from Senegal, so I visit every now and then, and this was my first trip there in 2010. And we went to this particular site, which is a space where enslaved people were held before they were shipped to various parts of the Atlantic. And Gorée Island, of course, is originally, it initially was a Dutch colony. Gorée is from Gorée in the Netherlands. But for a very long time, it was a French colony and an important part of the French Atlantic world. And what happened when I visited this space, so you can see this is like the front door. This is a space where enslaved people were held while they were basically kept there until there were enough people to fill a ship, or until there was a ship to transport them to other parts of the Atlantic. And this is the door of no return, as many of these castles, forts, factories will have this place where enslaved people would have been taken really from the African continent in little ships to this main ship, so their last contact with the African continent. And it was when I visited this place that I'd been studying slavery for a long time, at least six years, if not much longer. When I entered this space, and especially these holding cells, I became physically ill. I had a very physical response to it. And it took me by surprise, just the fact that it was as if you could feel the suffering that had taken place in that space. That was the moment that I realized that there was something about spaces that we can't always get when we use written sources. Something about the spaces where people lived, worked, were held in bondage that tells a story that sometimes gets lost when we focus only on written sources. And this is especially in the case of enslaved people, because of course they produced very few written sources themselves. And so the sources that we're using to write these histories oftentimes are produced by the people who enslaved them. And so looking at these spaces more closely was a way for me to kind of be able to think about the history of slavery differently. And so when I came to back to the US after that trip, and I was really I was finishing up my dissertation and then working on revising it for the book, and that took me another 10 years. I made it a point to visit the spaces of enslavement. So in New York City, I would visit South William Street, which on this old map is right there, number 1, which was the home of the enslaved people, the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. In the 1640s and 50s, there's a period of time when that was their home, where they were enslaved. And so that's a space that you can still visit today, right? You can walk those streets and kind of figure out how long would it have taken them to go from South William Street, their home here on what then was called the Slijksteeg, to the church, which at some point was right here, and later on, of course, in the fort there. Or how long would it have taken them to walk to the courthouse? We see enslaved people in the courthouse very frequently in Amsterdam. Well, the courthouse was right here, so that was really not so far from where they were living. Similarly, the taverns, the many taverns, there are some here right on the corner next to their, almost next to their house. I also made it a point to visit the churches that I was writing about, and this is one of them, the Reformed Church of Shangang. I hope I say that correctly. Different people tell me different pronunciations, but that's one of them. I made it a point to visit those churches to see what's the architecture and try to help, try to figure out how did architecture change over time and how would that have influenced the people who were enslaved and attending these churches or worshiping in these churches, where would they have been located and so forth. I also made it a point to visit the homes where enslaved people lived. And this became very important in actually thinking through enslavement and slavery in New York, is that, and I'll show you this later on, but there's this way of talking about slavery in New York as in enslaved people lived in the homes of their enslavers, right? Like they lived in the same homes, they worked alongside each other, they worshiped sometimes alongside each other. And there's this idea that somehow means that slavery in New York was, as James Fenimore Cooper says, enslaved people were like part of the family. Well, when you look at these homes, you see that that's absolutely not the case if we look at the architecture. They were not in the same spaces as the people who enslaved them. So here you see an image of the Loft House in what today is Brooklyn, New York. And this is the initial home built in the early 18th century. Initially this structure was built and then this was added. It was a kitchen. And not that long ago, researchers found that enslaved people actually had been living under the eaves in this area. So small that for a long time people didn't even realize that anybody had been living there. And the only way that you can access that space is there's a closet in the kitchen area where somebody discovered that the ceiling could open up and that there was a little stair that you could pull out. And that stairs leads to these stairs, and then on the sides were 2 garret spaces where they found evidence of people actually having lived in those spaces. And this is one of those spaces. Now you can see that would have been impossible to stand up in there. There's no natural light. There was a beehive style oven in this space, so there would have been some heat during winter months. They could use that to warm up some food. There were many people who were likely living in that space. These are the people who by 1800 were enslaved by the Lot family. And so visiting those spaces gave me a very different perspective of what slavery in New York really looked like. It's different from reading, we have these enslaved people these people that were enslaving versus actually seeing where they spent their times. There were also locks on the outside of these garret spaces. It's not sure if they were used to lock these people inside at night, but it's definitely possible. So, and I should note, these pictures were taken by a professional photographer. When I visited that space, I took a picture with an iPhone and you could barely see anything. I mean, it's just pitch black. I also participated in the Slave Dwelling Project, and this is a project by Joseph McGill, who takes people to different places, spaces of enslavement. And he will stay overnight there, and that's why it's called the Slave Dwelling Project. And he's also been to some places in New York, actually. I believe not that long ago he was at Van Cortlandt Manor. He was at Stanton Hall when I was in Philadelphia, and so I participated in that one. And so this is in Pennsylvania. Stanton Hall, though, is a very similar kind of home to, for example, Schuyler Mansion or the Tim Brooke Mansion in the Albany area, Georgian-style manor house that was very common in the late 18th century. And so we stayed there, we had dinner, we had conversations, and we slept there overnight. I slept in this space, which was one of the garret spaces where they believe some of the enslaved people at Stanton slept. And what I learned from that experience was how easy it is to hear things. It would have been very difficult to move through these houses unnoticed. You could hear somebody turning on the floor below. It was really fascinating. So all of those things helped me kind of think through, what can these spaces tell me about the experience of enslaved people in New York? And that's when, I went back to the sources and back to the research, and I included this visiting of these different spaces. And so some of the findings with doing that include, for example, looking at the New Netherlands, the enslaved people who lived in New Amsterdam. So the same people that lived at the Slijksteeg. And I was able to really kind of get a good sense by mapping them. Where were they living? Where would they have worshipped? It helped me tell a story about their experiences in New York or New Amsterdam that previously was a little bit vague. It also helped me understand how important control of space was. So when we look at the 17th century, and I'm sure many of you know these stories of enslaved people in New Amsterdam during the Dutch colonial period, being able to obtain their freedom, worship in the Dutch Reformed Church, go to the court. I mentioned that previously, right? Like they would actually argue cases in the first of the council and later on also in New Amsterdam City Court. And they were selling goods, the markets, they were attending the various taverns, meeting there for drinks. And, this is not something that we very commonly see when we look at slavery. And in New York, this changed significantly in the 18th century. And so the question is always, why is that? And one of the arguments made is oftentimes that, well, it was the Dutch colonial period, and the Dutch had a different approach to slavery. What I think was especially important in this case was the spatial layout of the town and the lack of restrictions, spatial restrictions. So enslaved people were not restricted. It's not that they had the right to use the courts, but they were not restricted from using the courts. They were not restricted from attending the Dutch Reformed Church. They were not restricted from drinking alcohol or going to the taverns or selling goods. And so they did those things. They were able to, use the lack of those restrictions on their movement, on their access to these spaces. They also were able to, being in this area where everything is really close together. If you're enslaved, one of the key parts of enslavement is that somebody else controls your movement, right? Largely controls it. If you are in an area where everything is in close proximity, there's less of that to really keep you bound in one space. So they were able to do all these things in New Amsterdam. In fact, some of them were able to obtain their freedom, obtain land in Manhattan in the area of Greenwich Village. I actually visited today the corner of Houston and Bowery is where Mike and Domingo van Angola had a piece of land right on the corner there. We have the deeds. We can visit those spaces today. Minetta, is it Minetta Lane?
Yes.
It used to be called the Negroes Causeway. Like that was part of this neighborhood of freed Africans who obtained land north of New Amsterdam. And so when we think about it in spatial terms, then we see how they're able to move through this town, and how they're able to then really expand, kind of push back against the limits of their enslavement. Now that significantly changes in the latter part of the 17th and into the 18th century. And so that is, and here's actually, so this is Micah and Domingo Falangola. That's their plot of land. So these are those people that you saw. Let me just go back. These men were some of the people. There are many more, but they are a group of men who in 1644 were able to obtain their freedom, conditional freedom, because there were significant conditions to it, together with their wives. And so they settled in this area, and the ones that are listed in that 1644 petition actually are in bold here. And Domingo and Micah Falangola are separate from that, but they're the ones that live there. So you can see this area, being a significant free black population. Actually, many of those people worshipped in this area, right, at the Bowery, at the chapel of Stuyvesant, and Micah and Domingo Falangola were among them. Now, in the 18th century, this all significantly changes. So we see in the 18th century that, and it starts really at the latter part of the 17th. You can see that here with this 1682 ordinance that prohibited enslaved New Yorkers from leaving their enslavers' property without permission. What starts happening during this period is that increasingly the movements and activities of enslaved people become restricted, more and more restricted, limited in legislation and so forth. So enslaved people no longer can move through the city without the permission of their enslavers. They no longer can drink alcohol. They're actually not allowed to purchase alcohol. They're not allowed to sell goods unless they have permission from their enslavers. So they can't sell or buy goods in the city anymore. They're also increasingly limited from churches, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So in all of those levels, we see that they are increasingly controlled, and their movement through spaces is increasingly controlled. And with that, they have fewer opportunities to kind of push back against these boundaries of their enslavement. So here are just some of the laws that were a part of that significant change. Now, I should note that it's also during this period that the enslaved population increases significantly. The population in general in New York increases, and with that, the enslaved population as well. So there's also a real fear of enslaved people and what they might be able to do if they organize. And of course, there is the 1712 slave revolt. There's the killing of the Hallett family in 1708, I believe it was, in Long Island, where a whole family was killed by two people they enslaved. And so there were these instances that really also made the population more fearful even of the people that they held in bondage. Now, with this, we see that there's also patrols in New York. This is just one of them. This is the Society of Apprentice Slaves, which was in Shangung, which was really community organized, where enslavers came together and they said, we need some sort of a system. As you can see, this is by 1796, but we see such patrols throughout the 18th century. So here they are, in this particular case, they're organizing to make sure that they can, anybody who holds people in bondage would give the names of the people that they're enslaving to this society, and then if one of those people that they listed tries to run away, this society would have these patrols that would then try to catch them. Now, what's important is that even if you were not part of these patrols, if you were an individual, you could stop any black person, ask them for their papers to make sure that they were legitimately moving from one place to another. And sometimes there were rewards even for that if you were able to obtain somebody who was trying to run away. So what we see is that for enslaved black New Yorkers, and frankly also for free black New Yorkers, it became increasingly hazardous to move from one place to another. And you always had to prove that you were legitimately in those spaces and you were legitimately moving through those spaces. Now we also see in the cities, like in New York City, they had watchmen, bellmen, they had the same in Albany. So in cities, this is very rural, but in cities we also see that they're patrolling the streets, and there's various reasons why they had those patrols, but those patrols were also in part helping to make sure that enslaved people are not walking the streets or gathering in the streets. New York at some point didn't allow more than 4 enslaved people to actually gather in the streets of the city. So the bellmen and watchmen would, amongst others, be in charge of kind of making sure that those gatherings didn't happen. Now, I also was able, by thinking about spaces, I also was able to kind of get a different sense of what was going on in the churches, the Dutch Reformed churches. And I didn't look at these Dutch Reformed churches so much at the religion and the theology and slavery, but more so really the practical aspects of it. These were also important community spaces, social spaces. And if you were a part of these churches, that opened certain doors for you. If you were kept out of them, then obviously you could not move up in society in the same way. And so when we look at these Dutch communities, and the ones I focus on are like Ulster County, Albany County, Kings County, one of the things that we see is that increasingly enslaved people, whereas in the 17th century, many of them were worshiping in the Dutch Reformed Church, they were marrying, they had their children baptized there. Increasingly, we see that that's no longer the case. And there's a lot of, nobody really understood what was going on. And I think to this day, there's different theories that we could kind of explore. But one of the things that I found in the Brooklyn Historical Society was this letter by a Reverend Peter Lowe, who was in charge of the English language services at the 6 congregations of Kings County.
Where?
Kings County, so Brooklyn. And he was together with Schoonmaker. He was in charge of he was the Reverend in charge of the Dutch services. So they together would rotate between these 6 congregations. And he wrote a letter. I found this at the Brooklyn Historical Society. He wrote this letter to a friend, an anonymous friend, in 1788, in which he detailed 10 reasons why his congregants did not allow a group of black men who wanted to become members in his church. They did not allow them to become full members. And those 10 reasons were really, in many ways, shocking. And I've listed just a few of them here. So one of them, the first one was they have no souls. The fourth one was they are a species very different from us. Witness their nauseous sweat, complexion, manners, etc. I cannot endure them near to me. I would be ashamed to commune with them. The 8th objection, if many Negroes be admitted, I tremble for the ark. I joy order and harmony in the Dutch church. See the absurd consequences Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight, Negro elders, deacons, church masters, etc. So these are just a few of them. They also said they are descendants from Ham. They also said that they would be too much like the Methodist Church if they would actually accept Africans in the church, or African Americans. And what it shows, and I should note, To each of these objections, the reverend of the church had a rebuttal. He did not agree with them. So Peter Lowe did not agree with them. He actually said, in response to the first one, "Where is yours?" You know, if you say something like that. But he couldn't do anything because it was the congregation that decided that they wouldn't allow these men in the church. It did eventually go to the synod, and actually there were whole debates about this, and eventually the church decided that enslaved people should be allowed in the Dutch Reformed Church. But it's one of these examples, first of all, where we can see some of the reasons why enslaved people wouldn't be present in these Dutch Reformed churches in the 18th century as frequently as they were in the 17th century. Increasingly, they are held out of these churches, and it is very local. It's not something that the Dutch Reformed Church said, we do not want enslaved people in our churches. I believe it really was depending on the community, and especially in communities where a lot of people were holding people in bondage, we see a lot of resistance to including these people in the church. It changes by the latter part of the 18th century, but up until that point, it's very rare. There are cases, but it's very rare. And I should note that at this point in Brooklyn, New York, about 30% of the population was enslaved. In some of the townships in Brooklyn, about 75% of the households included enslaved people. So about 75% of households had people enslaved in this particular area. So it's no surprise then that there were real worries. What if we accept Africans in our church, enslaved people in our church, black people in our church? Does that mean that then, if they are considered equal before God, will they also start to claim that same equality beyond the church, outside of the church? Now, when we look at this more in a spatial way, we see then that also increasingly in the 18th century, oftentimes enslaved people are not in these churches altogether. And when they oftentimes are in a separate section, especially as the numbers are growing toward the latter part of the 18th century. This is the first church in Albany, and you can see here, so this is the gallery, and the enslaved people were in this area, the back benches on the first floor and the back benches of the second floor. And even then, we see these tensions, as you can see here, when Daniel Winner in 1815 informed the treasury that he would pay for his pew only, and I'm quoting now, provided the consistory will remove the blacks from behind his pew as was understood. And there are some other references like this in the records of the First Church of Albany, where the enslaved people that are in the church, oftentimes in the back, are redirected to other parts because congregants are objecting to the close proximity of enslaved and free black people close to them in these churches. We also see that even if they are accepted as full members, usually they were not allowed to go for communion at the same time. They would have to wait until white congregants had communion, and then they would be allowed to get communion. So there were different ways in which in these churches they were segregated and separated from the main congregation. And we kind of can see from some of these records the sentiments behind that, right? Like why they were doing this. Now, I also was able, by looking at spaces, to get a better understanding of what's enslavement in the houses, in these homes, actually meant, and what it would have looked like. And I showed you the lot house, right, where enslaved people were living in garret spaces, so small that they could not stand up straight in them. There were also the cases, like Schuyler mentioned, where in the 18th century, as there are more people who are holding people in bondage, and some of them, a significant number of them, like the Schuyler family had over 10 people that they held in bondage. And we see increasingly that people like that are also organizing their homes in a way where they consider, well, where do you house these enslaved people, or where do you have them labor in these spaces? And Schuyler Mansion is a really good example of this, I think, because we actually see, so Schuyler mentioned, now in Albany, New York, then it was, at the time it was just outside of it, built in the 1760s when Philip Schuyler already had a significant number of people that he held in bondage. And the enslaved people that Schuyler mentioned were living very likely in the cellar of the home. What we see in New York is that oftentimes enslaved people were held either in the attic, garret spaces, or in the cellar of homes, sometimes in outside buildings. So that happened as well, but those are kind of the main areas where people were enslaved. And so, as Schuyler mentioned, they were in the cellar, and this is the back of the home. There would have been one entrance right here somewhere, and this model shows you how there actually was a walled courtyard. So the enslaved people would get from the cellar into that walled courtyard. And that meant that even like physically their movements were very much constrained, right, by this actual wall. They also were able to be watched through these windows in the back of the home, while at the same time their labor and activities were hidden from guests and visitors to the home, because if you come from the front, you don't see kind of that clutter of this working type plantation, or the labor of enslaved people. It's very much kind of hidden behind those walls. So this was one of these spaces where you could see even the panopticon model in a way, where enslaved people, and this is very common in other parts, where enslaved people, even if they're not watched, they never know if somebody is watching them. So they always will keep in mind that they potentially are being surveilled. And so we see it in the architecture of some of these homes. And this leads me to another part of thinking about space. So we have kind of the physical spaces, the fact that enslaved people were living in garret spaces where there's no natural light and they can't stand up, or cellars that oftentimes were humid and dark, oftentimes in controlled spaces, held in bondage. There's also the fact that they experienced those spaces very differently from the people who enslaved them on an emotional level, of course. These were not spaces of family or domesticity or safety. These were spaces of forced labor, forced family separation, or the potential for that happening at any time. This is part of Sojourner Truth's narrative, and she's one of the few voices of enslaved people in New York that we actually have, like people who lived in slavery in New York. And in her narrative, she narrates her experiences as an enslaved girl and woman in Ulster County, New York. And one of the parts of her narrative that really, really stuck with me talks about their enslaver passing away. So one of the stories about slavery in New York is that, families were staying together, right? Like enslavers, Dutch American enslavers would put every effort to keep the people that they were enslaving together. Children, mothers, fathers, siblings. In reality, when you look at the records, there's bills of sale of children all the time, as young as 1 year old. There's wills that bequeath children sometimes that are not even born yet already to their children. And this is something that enslaved people knew, that this could happen at any moment. And it might not even be that their enslaver plans for this, but when that person dies, they, it's not in their hands, right? So what we see happening is what, for example, Sojourner Truth here is discussing when their enslaver passes away, Charles Hardenberg. At that point, so Sojourner lived with her father and mother in the home of the Hardenbergs, father, mother, and brother. She had many more siblings who all already had been separated from her parents. When Charles Hardenberg passes away, she writes about seeing her mother weeping, finding her mother weeping frequently. And I'm just going to read it to you because I think she says it really, in a way I could never do so. She writes about this, and so she narrates it. Somebody else writes about her, so it's in the third person, and Sojourner Truth at the time still went by Isabella Baumfree. After this event, she was often surprised to find her mother in tears. And when, in her simplicity, she inquired, "Mama, what makes you cry?" she would answer, "Oh, my child, I'm thinking of your brothers and sisters that have been sold away from me." And she would proceed to detail many circumstances respecting them. But Isabella long since concluded that it was the impending fate of her only remaining children, which her mother bit too well understood even then, that called upon those memories from the past and made them crucify her heart afresh. Basically what she's saying here is that her mother in that moment knew that Isabella and her brother would soon be taken from her as well. Isabella was 8 years old, and she was indeed, shortly after, sold at the auction block, as was her brother, and her parents lost the last 2 children they had by their side. And this was a reality for any enslaved person in New York. There's no guarantee that you would be with your family, that you would be with your children. They could be separated from you really at any time. And so we see these runaway slave advertisements like this one, where people are oftentimes fleeing the homes in which they are enslaved, but also looking for family members, as is the case here with Mary, who is supposed to be with her mother. And we see that oftentimes enslaved people who are fleeing the homes where they're living, because that's not where their family is. They're moving toward family members who are living elsewhere in the colony, in the state, or sometimes beyond. And this is also in Long Island, right, in Kings County. Now, I finally just briefly want to mention it. I don't have a lot of time to really dig into this, but if you have questions, I can answer them. I want to just note that as the movements of enslaved people are increasingly restricted in New York and controlled and surveilled, what we do see is that enslaved people are constantly pushing back against that. So enslaved people are hiding objects under floorboards, as they did at the Lot House. You can see some of those items here. A cloth pouch with a goat pelvis and an oyster shell, which was a religious item for many people of African descent. And so it very likely was placed in that space to safeguard that space, to protect the people in that space. We also see that enslaved people were still very much traveling down the streets of New York when they were not supposed to. We're still meeting in groups. They knew how to avoid the watchmen. They knew how to move to alleyways and backyards to go from one place to another. So enslaved people were always pushing back against these spatial restrictions that were imposed upon them. But it became increasingly difficult and, of course, oftentimes also very dangerous to do so. So I want to end with this part from James Fenimore Cooper, because I think that this speaks to how, in some ways, the memory of slavery in New York has shaped into this narrative that slavery in New York somehow was not as bad as slavery elsewhere. And that was in part because enslaved people lived in the same homes of their masters or worked alongside them. He says, in part, New York never had slaves in the system of Southern planters or in gangs of hundreds to labor in the fields under overseers and who lived apart in cabins of their own. But our system of slavery was strictly domestic, the Negro almost invariably living under the same roof with the master, or if his habitation was detached, as certainly sometimes happened, it was still near at hand, leaving both races as part of a common family. If you look closely at these spaces and the experiences and the circumstances of enslaved and free people in those spaces, it's evident that that is absolutely false, right? But this is something that up until today still really resonates with people. You still hear that type of kind of representation of slavery in New York somehow being different from slavery elsewhere, or at least different from the South. And what I would say is that yes, the labor differed, but the system of enslavement was very similar in New York as it was in the South. And that is where I'm going to leave it for now, so that we have some time for questions. So there's some books still there. You can also order it online with a discount code if you want. I want to just say, like I started, I was so focused on, is the camera on? I didn't even thank Sarah for organizing and for the Holland Society for having me. And it really is a great honor to be here tonight with you. Like I said, like I really come from thinking about this as service, as it being public history. Like it's important that this history gets researched so that it can get into the public and people learn more about this history. And it's only when there's people like me and other historians who do the research that we can kind of change how we look at these different histories. So I'm very grateful to be here, and thank you all so much for joining me. And please, if you have any questions, I would be very happy to elaborate on anything information. Go ahead.
I was fascinated by your description of New Amsterdam in the 17th century. Curious about a detail. When you talked about the William Street house, now can you describe, what does that mean, house? Where was the master?
Where was the
owner of the slaves?
So those were the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and so it was a house. It's referred to as a house. It's referred to as the house of the slaves of the company, and it had some ground around it. In deeds and such, it's referred to as such. That's why we know it's there. But they were the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, and they wouldn't all have lived there at the same time. The company frequently rented out labor to individuals, to different boweries, and so some people may have been living at a bowery at certain times, or be in different places, but many of them would have been living in the house.
The Dutch West India Company would have had employees at that location to supervise and organize what happened.
Yeah. So the company was located, centered in the fort, right? But that was not really far from there. There was also an overseer of the company's slaves, and I don't know where that person actually lived, but there was somebody who's on record as that being their position. So there was, and just to note, like I focused on them being able to move through that community. One thing that oftentimes gets forgotten when talking about these people in the 17th century is that there's also references in the documents of the company slaves working in chain gangs. So, and that actually became a punishment for certain people to work alongside the company slaves in the chains. So it's not as if the experience was all, great extent of freedom in some ways. There was also those other parts of the experiences of enslaved people in New Amsterdam.
And lastly, how did the conditions change after the English came?
So it became increasingly restricted. This is what, and also society becomes increasingly racialized in the latter part of the 17th century and into the 18th century. That is not particular to New York, though. We see this everywhere. So what I talked about earlier, when you look at the 17th century Virginia, for example, we also see in Virginia that there were enslaved people who were able to obtain freedom, who were able to get land, to attend the church. There was a lot more intermarriage in Virginia, and there was some intermarriage in New Amsterdam as well, between people of African and European origins. And in all of those areas, by the latter part of the 17th century, that slowly starts to change, where legislation increasingly targets people of African descent, limits their movements. And I say people of African descent because it really extends in some ways beyond enslaved people. There's one law in, I believe it's in 1730, but I might be slightly off, that or ordinance, it states that because increasingly black people are raking for oysters, they will no longer be allowed to rake for oysters unless they are accompanied by a white person. So simply having a white person with them legitimizes their activities in these public spaces. But without that, they would not be allowed to do that. So there's really, it's increasing the development of a system of bondage that has all this legislation and such, but it's also increasingly a racialized system where as a person with a darker skin color, you would always have to prove that you are legitimately in spaces, that you are legitimately moving through those spaces, that your activities are legit, because by default, you're considered to be enslaved. Only if you can prove that you're free or that you have permission, then you can actually be in those spaces, whether you're free or enslaved, in many ways, so, yeah. Thank you for those questions. Who else has a question? Or a thought? Yeah, go ahead.
What was slavery outlawed in New York State?
So 1827 is when it's completely abolished, and there's it starts with the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799, but there are adjustments to that in the course of the period after. But basically what that meant initially, that any enslaved person born after that moment was, so 1799, was enslaved for a certain number of years. And I believe, and I might be slightly off here, I believe for men it was 27 years and for women 25. And then they would be able to become free. Now, if you were born before 1799, basically you could be enslaved for life still. But that's what they ended in 1827. So they basically said, you know, anybody, like there's no more slavery. But when you look at the census records, there are still enslaved people in the census records. Even in 1840, there's a handful of people who are actually on the census record designated as slave. So it's not that it's completely gone, but technically it is. There's also some instances where we see enslaved people moving into a form of servitude that has lots of restrictions, where you kind of can see a continuation of slavery just by a different name. There's one document that really stood out to me when researching this, where it said the document said slave, and then it striked out and then changed into servant, so you could see how there still was kind of this assumption that the person was enslaved, or that sentiment. So yeah, and you know, this is important too, right? 1827 is less than 40 years before the end of the Civil War, right? That's just one generation that there's no slavery in New York when there is slavery in the South. Yet there's oftentimes this association of slavery with the South rather than the North. But it's really just a very brief time period if you look at it. On top of that, by 1827, New York had slavery for 200 years, whereas a place like Georgia at the end of the Civil War had slavery a little over 100 years. Still, when we think of slavery, we think of Georgia more so than we think of New York, right? But it really was an integral part of New York society. I mean, it has to be after 200 years. So, yeah. Yeah.
I heard something about Alexander. I guess you mentioned the Schuler family and about Alexander Hamilton, or whether the Hamilton family also either made adult slaves or kept slaves themselves. Have you found anything?
So I did not research Hamilton, but there's somebody who's done some really good work on this, and I'm blanking on her name now. I don't know if anybody knows. I believe she works for Schuyler Mansion. And she wrote an article on this that actually traces the connections between Alexander Hamilton and slavery. And from what I understand, he definitely enslaved people. Yeah. But check that article, because she did a really good job of writing about that. And yeah, Alexander Hamilton visited Schuyler Mansion. I believe he got married in Schuyler Mansion. So it's a very close link with that specific
And arranged
space.
for St. Mark's Church. He was our lawyer.
Ah.
That got us separated from Trinity.
Oh, wow.
And what's interesting is that he had written a number of things one of Cindy's point of view in some ways was a little bit less ignorant, but also the connection with the family. I think I have read this article, and it's interesting because there isn't anything definitive, but it clearly, his in-laws kept many people in bondage, and he never spoke out about that. So
Yeah. That might be it. Like I said, I haven't actually looked closely into him, but I remember that this article caused quite an uproar in some circles.
I recently saw the Ben Franklin documentary, and it's interesting as well there, because from an early, in his newspaper, he had published advertisements for slave auctions. At the same time, he published essays talking about the evils of slavery, and then also self-kept slaves. So it's amazing how society can reinforce certain ideas that clearly just the double standard that people can have is crazy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, especially the Revolutionary era when you think about that. But even like, I remember the whole like teaching about Georgia when initially Georgia was founded by Oglethorpe. They were not supposed to have slavery in Georgia, and then the settlers of Georgia were really opposed to that. They wanted slavery, and one of the arguments they made was that they should have the freedom to own property, and the property was other human beings, right? And so there's this kind of reoccurring, because this is throughout the 18th century. Like we see this also in the events leading up to the Civil War, right? Like, can you actually move an enslaved person from the South into the North and still keep them in bondage? Is that an issue of the right to property, even if that is a human being? So it's really fascinating, and I think that this is also one of the things that the Lowe letter actually I think was a really good example of how, we're oftentimes taught that that's just the way things were at the time, right? And that's just how people thought. But when you see Lowe and how he responds to the people in his congregation, you can see that not everybody, like there was pushback. There were people who understood, some of these things as being inherently wrong. And so, but it's interesting to see that in some of those records, and to see that tension between those ideas always. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
It was such a
Sarah.
pleasure talking to you.